And we are live. Hearty good morning to everyone. And it's so awesome again to connect here in our virtual auditorium for some inspiration and wisdom. So welcome on the 208th day of lockdown, although we are at level 1, so it's a tad easier. But welcome to Milpark Business School's next episode in our Tomorrow is Beautiful webinar series. Today, it's our honor, our guest speaker, George Woods, CEO of the Order of St. John, who will share from his Emporium of Wisdom 21 reasons why business will never be the same again in a post-pandemic world. Now, friends and colleagues, visitors to our auditorium, George is a seasoned C-suite business leader and coach, digital transformation strategist and consultant, consumer behaviorist, and university lecturer with 27 years of experience gained across the retail, professional services, and management consulting, as well as financial services and humanitarian sectors. His progressive record of continuing professional development is balanced by impactful attitudes in entrepreneurial and innovation thinking, where he has cemented solid foundations in up-to-the-minute digital processes and tools required to fast-track sustainable, value-based growth in future-focused organizations. George, fantastic to have you with us. Thank you for spending time with us today. And we're looking so forward to the insights you have to share with us today. So without any further hesitation, it's over to you. Thank you, George.
Thanks so much, and thank you for the invitation. It is such an incredible topic. Just as we were getting ready to go on air, we were saying that I think we all accept that the world is no longer the same. So much of what we understood around economics, what we understood around our interaction with each other, so much of that has changed, and we get to explore that this morning. But I thought what I would do as an opening ambit is just look at regenerative economics in this context. There is so much thinking and research going into where to from here. So business has changed. Businesses that were around for well over 100 years are finding themselves challenged. We are in the fourth industrial revolution. We are seeing the emergence of artificial intelligence. And so this is a whole new minefield for us, so to speak. And so I thought I'd just share 8 principles, and then we'll go into the presentation around the regenerative economics. And it is around organizations that are going to survive, which ties in very nicely. And they're organizations that seek balance. They are in right relationship with communities, with each other, staff, in other words, cultures and values. They look at wealth now as a holistic concept. It's no longer about pure financial wealth. And so, I know we'll get into the conversation, well, what about capitalism? And does that still have a role in the way we move forward? They are organizations that are innovative, they're adaptive, and they're responsive. They empower participation. They honor their place in community. They, in fact, are organizations that are purpose-led, values-driven, and have an abundance mindset. And I think what we found ourselves in now is a conversation where we say, well, money supply, business has changed, so how does one affect an abundance mindset? And they have robust circulation. In other words, recycling the planet within their hearts and minds. And so these are organizations that are actually starting to chart a new way forward. So if we can go to the next slide. This is an event that has shaped the globe and society at large, more so than any other. And so we begin to ask questions in this almost post-pandemic world, we hope, second wave dependent. What does it mean for the future of how we buy homes? What does it mean for travel? What does it mean for how we view each other and interact? Or the levels of surveillance and privacy, so governance and ethics in artificial intelligence, and perhaps even the language we use. we are in a changed world. Humanity is an integral part of this interconnected web of life. There's no real separation between us and it. The scale of economies, the reach of globalization, all of these narratives that we've got used to are in fact changing. And so we could, at the risk of being anxious about it, be really, really concerned, because everything we understood yesterday is not necessarily the same today. And so our narrative has changed. The way we're interacting in this auditorium has changed. So if we can look at the next slide. So I drew on the research of Politico magazine, and I'm going to draw on some speakers today who have looked at this brave new world of ours. They are smart macro thinkers. And then, of course, what we'll do is we'll draw this back down to a local environment and say, well, what does this mean for us? What does it mean in this new, completely interconnected world where a little-known province in China is now very known, a wave of this virus, a mutational virus, has spread the world over. And also, these thinkers start to draw on the concept, this is not our first experience of a virus like this. And so there's this juxtaposition that happens between the 1918 Spanish flu and, of course, 102 years later, or 101 years later, as it started, there is this new pandemic. In the last 2 decades, we've in fact had 5 different viruses of such veracity that have impacted this world. However, this is the first time since 1918 that we declare a truly global pandemic. Let's look at the next slide. So Politico magazine surveyed 30 smart macro thinkers. And they looked at elements around this virus and the influencing factors. And as we know, this virus keeps us in our homes. This virus is reorienting our relationship to governments. So if we take South African government, council, parliament, provincial government has moved into an online world. Voting has now moved into online virtual voting. So what does that say about our relationship to governments, and what does it say around how we orientate ourselves? What about our relationship to the outer world and even to each other? And so we begin to ask questions like, will nations remain closed, and for how long? I looked with interest the other day at travel to the UK. So South Africa is considered a medium risk country in terms of the virus. The United Kingdom is now considered a high risk environment in terms of the virus. What about the awkwardness of when we see each other? Do we hug? Do we shake hands? How do we interact? And then, interestingly enough, what will become of restaurants and the hospitality sector? So much of this is up in the air. And what these writers try to do is they begin to try to attempt to answer those questions. And so the way the flow of this presentation will go, we'll explore these writers, and then I will offer to you 21 reasons that I think the business world has changed forever. Now, as we know, crisis presents opportunity. We are seeing the more sophisticated and flexible use of technology. And this has become the great leveler. And that's what we mean by less polarization. So accessibility is extraordinary. I'll give you an example. In our organization, I chair a digital work group across 9 countries. This was impossible before. It was impossible unless we met and were able to engage on that level. So we have reduced the polarization. South Africa is running a digital transformation program for 9 countries. What about the simpler things in life? A revised or a reviewed and revived appreciation of the outdoors. The simple things in life have started to take on new meaning again. And I would argue that that is, in fact, a really, really positive outcome. What about the unknown ways in which society will evolve, react to healthcare, the economy? How about our lifestyles? And more of that is changing. We think of how important home has become. We were touching on this just before. Work-life balance really requires a new paradigm here. Boundaries need to be reset. Next slide. Move on to Professor Deborah Tannen, Professor of Linguistics. She argues that 9/11 brought about a feeling of vulnerability as the events that occurred were only in foreign lands and never on home soil. So if we think of this within the South African context or within an African context, a terror attack, not necessarily a likely event. A global pandemic originating in China, not a real event in our psyche. And yet, March happened, and we went into a hard lockdown. She then goes into the 2008 financial meltdown and told us that we could suffer calamities of past eras. The Great Depression relived. And so 2008 taught us that. The Great Depression of the early 1920s. As I alluded to earlier, the 1918 flu pandemic is a reoccurred sudden specter in our lives. And interestingly enough, if you look at the quarantine rules that were applied in 1918, not terribly different from what we have today. What about the loss of innocence or complacency, which is a new way of being in this world? Next slide. We now know that touching people is risky. Breathing in the air in an enclosed space is not a great idea. How quickly this awareness has grown. It could become second nature to recoil when shaking hands or touching our faces. I recall watching a conversation the other day on Zoom with 13 countries that were participating. And I remember being struck by how many times people were touching their faces. And suddenly we're aware of this. What about the comfort of being in the presence of others? Might in fact be replaced by a greater comfort of absence, especially with those we don't know. And I alluded to this in the preamble to this conversation. What about mental health issues? What about where people see themselves? So many of us attach our identity to what we do, to whom we interact with, how we interact. This is changing. Next slide. Professor Mark Lawrence Schrad, a political scientist, he says nations have equated patriotism with the armed forces. However, you can't shoot a virus. Okay, and so whilst we are incredibly hopeful about the work that's coming out of Oxford University at the moment in collaboration with South Africa and other nations, the vaccine hopefully will be forthcoming soon. But actually, our very idea of patriotism is changing. Those on the front lines against this virus aren't conscripts or mercenaries or enlisted army officers. They are doctors, nurses, pharmacists, teachers, caregivers, those who work in stores, utility workers, small business owners, etc. So our very idea of who heroes are has changed. We could add scientists, of course, to this mix as they work against the clock, trying to find a resolution to this virus. Thank you. Next slide. When all has been said and done, how will we recognize their sacrifice? The true frontline workers. Professor Mark Lawrence argues, will we give them guaranteed health benefits, corporate discounts? Will we build statues? And of course, we understand that that in itself is something in the social discourse of nations that is causing some concern. Will we have holidays for this new class of people? When all has been said and done, we too will finally understand a new breed of patriots who truly laid their lives on the line. And the reason I bring this to you is that we need to shift in our thinking. There's a new paradigm that this virus has brought about and our response to it. Next slide. Maybe demilitarization and love of community will be one of the benefits to come out of this awful mess. And to make no mistake, it is an awful mess. I think the true impact to South Africa's economy is yet to be understood. So I bring to you just something to think about. Thoughts for business in this respect are the following: new product lines, new means of creating value-added services. What about new insurance products? What about making life easier for those in the front line? Thoughts for governments. When all has been said and done, what kind of nations will we be left with? And what is this new narrative? And I've highlighted it in bold because it is a new narrative we need to get our heads around. Thank you. Next slide. Maybe this virus brings about the breaking of cultural, political, escalating depolarization of this age that has been observed developing in many nations. The contra is also true, that I think this virus has brought about acutely our understanding of the Gini coefficient that we have in this country and the difficulty that we have between rich and poor and trying to meet that gap. Maybe this virus brings about a change in course towards greater nation building and fighting a common enemy. The enemy is no longer us, but in fact, a virus that is hurting us. This virus is assisting societies in resetting priorities, bringing about new economic, more socially minded systems. And so I go back to my opening comment around regenerative economics, fascinating field. And in fact, I would argue would now be on a par with macroeconomic thinking, because if one's not driving those two in tandem with each other, what kind of preparedness are we putting out into the world in terms of economic thinking? The known economic systems are challenged in their ability to respond meaningfully, and the hard work to rebuild new systems is only just beginning. And so, folk, we can sit, and we can step back, and we can be like the ostrich with his head in the sand, and pretend none of this has happened around us, or in fact, we can engage in this topic and go, what does this mean? Thank you. Next slide. During the Second World War, the British War Cabinet were amazed at the ascendance of human goodness, altruism, compassion, and generosity of spirit that emerged during the Blitz of London. This ascendance is present again the world over. So what does this mean for business? What does it mean for a new consciousness that is in keeping with consumers who've changed their patterns and are more planet-minded? You will all agree, I'm sure, that during the hard lockdown globally, as much as it hurt us economically, what it did for the planet is the planet was able to breathe again. What it's done for product development is a much more planet-minded consciousness for product development. What does this mean for fashion houses, brands, and luxury goods? So the question I pose to you is for business to capitalize on the good that is ascendant. There is goodwill in the world. There is a generosity of spirit that has occurred as a result of this. Thank you. Next slide. Nations and their identities will never be the same again. The world has changed forever, and the patterns of human existence have shown the following: that societal shocks can break in different ways, making things better or worse. And given the current set of local and global shocks, the time is now to begin to promote more constructive patterns in our cultural and political discourse. The time for change is now. Next slide. So questions for business. Planning now needs to be in step with a new consumer psyche. Product development must now reflect this changing dynamic. Sales, marketing, communication, and brand must be reborn, i.e. here for good. Organizations that are purpose-led and values-driven and consider the regenerative economic principles, in fact, are very, very well placed. Extraordinary study that I looked at recently is how many non-governmental organizations across the world have managed to navigate this. I represent one in South Africa. We've managed to navigate this brave new world, and I would argue it's because we're purpose-driven. Our motivating factors, our ascendant factors are different. Let's move on. Another speaker I'd like to introduce you to as we begin to get to the 21 reasons. Nations that have had peace and affluence and high levels of consumer technology have become complacent. This is from Professor Tom Nichols of the Naval War College. Nations that have a high Gini coefficient are becoming complacent and inevitably have structural and political and economic divides. So this has brought about massive, massive change. So what does this mean? In the now yet to be named post-COVID economic and political construct. Next slide. The Gini coefficient, sometimes called the Gini-ratio, is a measure of statistical dispersion intended to represent the income inequality or wealth inequality. This is a statistician and sociologist who designed this concept called Corrado Gini. And this was published in a paper in 1912, called Variability and Mutability. I won't attempt the Italian on this occasion. Thank you. If you could go to the next slide. We look at the world, and we understand that the world has fundamentally changed. So where to from here? Next slide. Complacency in economically established nations exists due to the lack of historical fears. Oil, nuclear warfare, high unemployment, skyrocketing interest rates, and the receding fear of terrorism. All of these elements, Tom Nichols argues, in the developed world has in fact dissipated. So those historical fears are in fact dissipating. However, I think we would argue that wars in the future, as we understand, will be fought around arable land, water sources, etc. That's a conversation for another day. If we move on, developing nations' complacency arises from the lack of concern for the growing Gini coefficient, high unemployment, poor healthcare systems, political systems that favor the few and not the many. But in steps the virus. So what now? All those certainties that we had before have changed. We move on. The following changes, and business now needs to be acutely aware. It has forced people back into accepting that expertise matters, that good and serious governments matter, and the need to drive sensible policies and steer nations towards broader, more measured, sustainable prosperity matters. And next slide. So what is prosperity now? And so I bring to you the thinking of Frank Buchmann. Now, Frank Buchmann started or was part of a movement called moral rearmament just after the Second World War, during and after. And he was the one who coined the phrase that there is enough in this world for everyone's need and not enough for everyone's greed. So what does this say to us in a new moral rearmament movement for a more planet-minded, stable consciousness? What commercial systems need to be enabled now? What new economic systems need to be developed? Ability in commercial enterprise needs a new definition. Healthcare now has a broader responsibility base, and this is not confined to government and healthcare agencies. In fact, healthcare agencies now really have to reflect on how to accommodate the world in a new vaccine. Thank you. Moving on. So new ways of work for business, new urbanization principles to be defined, urban farming, urban green principles, inexpensive and green strategies. Within the city of Johannesburg, I've been hugely excited to watch the Urban City Initiative, where 7 buildings have now been converted into urban farms. What does this mean for retail space, corporate space, for those in corporate government, in corporate agencies that rent out corporate properties? What does all of this mean? What does it mean for those big fancy buildings in Sandton City or in Sandton? What does it mean for Discovery, where 80% of the workforce have not returned to the building that they've only recently opened. Or Nedbank, who I used to work with, a beautiful building in 135 Rivonia. What does it mean? New skills in the marketplace, new recruitment practices, new work-life balance principles. Moving on. What of our accumulated wealth is still wealth? Where to, as I've argued, for property development companies? Where to for large corporate real estate? What about the social human being? Our need to be connected, our need to be with each other. What about food security, global warming, and adaptations for local conditions? And so what I'm going to do now is I want to share with you the 21 reasons. So just bear with me. So thank you. So if we can go to, there we go, slide 1 of 7. So the 21 adaptations. Agility is the key now. Our strategic development rate of 100 years with the flexibility to evolve in 30 minutes. Now, what do I mean by this? All of us have in corporate world or in the organizations we work in have a strategic plan. And often that strategic plan is around the long-term goals. But actually, what we learned the day the virus hit and economic hard lockdown happened is that you had to switch very quickly. So our strategic radar needs to be really, really quick. And again, I draw your attention to regenerative economics and the principles there. What about new, not yet known product development? What I'm saying here is that consumer behavior has changed. It has fundamentally changed. The mere fact that you've been in lockdown and maybe has meant that you don't go to the shops all that often means that you're spending less. Maybe you're a little more selective about what you're spending. What about real estate and new market principles? The real estate market has changed. Now we face a very interesting situation. Expertise is the name of the game. That's what we sell now. What about an unemployed younger workforce and how we pair that with expertise? The fifth reason I believe the world has changed is new wealth is data. Big data is everything. Consumer spend, consumer patterns. Consumer behavioralists is a term that's going to start growing in prominence. New wealth is professional services and the ability to sell your services online, the ability to sell yourself and your consulting expertise online. I think we all accept that we will not be continuing with the careers that we set out to do. The age-old principle of remaining loyal to a company for years and years and years is being changed. It has been changed for a number of years. And so the ability to multitask, multi-career stream is where I think we're heading. New wealth is local markets with global outreach principles. So globalization, I do not believe is dead. I believe, in fact, globalization will only be enhanced. I think supply chain is a very different debate now. I think what local markets have realized the world over is that you don't want to tie yourself in to global markets. You need to have local resilience, local product supply. So a very interesting principle. Thank you. If we could move on. And this is something, and for a business school to really get its head around. Education will be free. Schools need to get their heads around this as well. How one sustains a business school or how one sustains a university and or school is in the product offering spectrum. It is in globalization. I mean, I noticed we've got folk on today from Romania as an example. I last night participated in a global discussion with Oxford University, Said Business School. Education is accessible now, and granted, in a Gini coefficient unequal society as ours, there is still the gap between rich and poor, and rich in this context is those who have access. Virtual reality is a new market. What about virtual travel agencies, augmented reality? What about the fluidity of thought and democracy? Climate matters will now take precedence. Medicine, vaccination is a fundamental human right. And this is an interesting topic, and we could spend a whole day just talking around vaccination and making medicine available to those who need it. What about borderless countries, borderless markets? I think we're heading into an unregulated space. Online commerce in that context is highly evolved, and if you do not exist online, you don't exist. And if you do not have the means to draw traffic to your websites, to your online shops, you do not exist. What about artificial intelligence and the mode of household delivery? We will foresee in the near future that in a perhaps continued lockdown mode, organizations will find other modes of delivery. The Amazons of the world, the Takealots of the world, artificial intelligence, robotics delivery, drone delivery. And as unnerving as that might sound, there are incredible opportunities for markets to evolve into this space. Thank you. Next slide. What about new democratic systems and virtual governments? That's where we're heading. The United States are going into an election period next week and the weeks after. And as you know, a lot of that will be virtual, will be online. I already mentioned that local, provincial, and national governments here in South Africa are already online as a factor of survival. New consumer demand patterns do not make any assumptions about what consumers want now. Consumer behavior patterns and consumerism is changing fundamentally. And so this does bring about one of the earlier points around new product, but it also brings about new modes of research and sourcing of data. Mass consumerism is no longer okay. So we are starting to ask the questions very fundamentally of ourselves. Where does the product come from? How was it produced? Was it responsibly sourced? Where was it made? Supporting local business will become a very key topic. Product trust needs a new label. So products that we have put into the marketplace require a new level of trust. And again, I draw your attention to regenerative economics as a key principle. And those 8 key principles. Is it in harmony with the planet? What are the value systems of those who produce the product? What are the value systems of the shareholders? Capitalism in its own right. Is it okay to make shareholders really wealthy? Or do we go back to the Frank Bookman principles of there's enough for everyone's need, not enough for everyone's greed? So product trust, I think, is going to be a new fundamental shift. Local supply chain is the way forward. As the economy has now experienced its decline, our view, and this is in conversation with a macroeconomist at the University of Stellenbosch Business School, is that assuming local government, national and provincial government, gets onto the agenda of let's rebuild the economy, there is at least a 10-year cycle of rebuilding ahead of us here. And it really is predicated on the fact that government is centered on rebuilding the economy. And so that context for local supply chain is an interesting one for us to observe. Corporate property portfolios need to be re-geared to retail and home ownership schemes. Will we own our own properties? What does this do in the context of title deeds and borrowing against property? What does it do in terms of those who've invested very heavily in property markets? And then finally, local markets, local support, and international patents is where I believe we're heading. And so thank you. Next slide. So before we go into Q&A, I want to remind you of the regenerative principles. Businesses that survive now, cognizant of some of those 21 reasons, are businesses that seek balance, are in right relationship with each other, their staff, values-led, purpose-driven, view wealth holistically. It's not simply about the money or shareholder value, are organizations that are innovative, adaptive and responsive, empowered participation. So in other words, draw on local markets, empowering staff, really freeing up delegations of authority, honors their place in community. In other words, If you're fishing responsibly. If you're mining responsibly. Has an abundance principle, okay, so looks to serve the greater whole, not just shareholders, and has robust circulation. In other words, seeks to recirculate product. And so I'll close with simply this. When we talk about recirculating product, our parents used to buy a car, call it a Toyota Corolla, and they used to drive it and drive it and drive it and drive it and keep it serviced, and you just kept that car going. Somehow, somewhere, there was a shift into higher brand consciousness, and we started to buy better cars. We bought them with maintenance plans, and after 5 years, after the maintenance plan expires, you simply trade the car in. Regenerative principles actually says, how do you keep maintaining and renewing and be less of a disposable economy, i.e. plastics, etc., and more of a regenerative economy, and says, this is how do we keep regenerating. And so, Cribs, I'm going to leave it there. That covers the presentation. I hope you've all found it interesting. It's a subject I truly love. It's an interesting, daring time for us, but be brave, embrace it, and ask what it means for you. Thank you.
Hi, George. We seem to have lost Cobus for a second there. Hi, everybody. My name is Michaela. I am the sort of project coordinator and tech behind the session. Thank you so much, George, for such an interesting and thought-provoking session. I think a lot of us are really, as you say, reevaluating how it's not just our position where we are now. It's the business. It's how that impacts everybody else in the system. It's kind of like our shift has changed fundamentally. And I particularly liked when you were talking about how, it's not just the consciousness that needs to flow from up top. It flows through all the way from property to what am I buying to how I'm interacting with people. It really sort of pervades everything we do. It's the way that COVID has taken us from one spot completely to the other. We've done a 180 in 6 months, which is incredible. So I'm going to ask our audience to ask us some questions. Okay, so we have one from Jane. Jane says, hi, George. Can you give us some examples of how you have changed with St. John's? That's a very good question, Jane.
Thank you. And Jane, lovely to hear from you. So, yeah, so St. John is a global NGO, operates in 41 countries worldwide. Best known for St. John Ambulance, St. John Hospice, St. John Hospitals, eye care hospitals around the world, community health initiatives. So we exist purely for good. That's why we exist. And so I go back, Jane, to the regenerative principles. I believe we've survived this because our purpose is right. Our purpose is service. Our purpose is humanity. But it was not without its challenge. And so when I alluded to the fact that we are chairing a digital work group for 9 countries, it was because we had to fundamentally shift into digital mode a whole lot quicker than we would have. So we hold the global standard on first aid training and on CPR, and we're a member of the Resus Council, and so there's a whole lot of medical speak that comes into that. But we had to fundamentally shift into online learning, and so South Africa went live with its online learning last week. And you will appreciate that doing online simulation for CPR or Resus or somebody who's in shock is a very interesting field. And so we've had to find a mode of blended learning, which is safe, etc. And so fundamentally, St. John has rejigged itself. It's nearly 1,000 years old. In 2 years' time, will be 1,000 years old. And a 1,000-year-old organization suddenly found itself at odds and at sea. And so yeah. we fundamentally had to rejig the way we operate. But I go back to the point that we are purpose-led and values-driven, and I think that was a huge driving force for good and survival.
Yeah, no, definitely. Ironically, George, one of, the connections are weird. My dad used to work at St. John's Ambulances, back in the day when he was in his early 20s. And yeah, so, it's that thing of, like you were saying, how do we manage training? How do we manage keeping that human aspect and keeping us within a context of, bring it back to education. It's a fascinating subject. And I think at Millpark, we are definitely rethinking, reshifting, redefining, and coming back to our original principles. Because I know many of you have heard over the last couple of sessions, tomorrow is beautiful is our line. And we really, really believe in that. And we are striving to develop ethical leaders. And it's a big thing to say for a business school. And I think it's that thing you're saying, going back to your principles, going back to your purpose, and using that as a pinpoint. We do have another question from Jane as well. She says, do you think that organizations should be taking a step back to reevaluate their purpose and reason for being now, instead of just trying to keep going in the same business as usual cycle? Yeah,
absolutely, Jane. And I think fundamentally that's a requirement.
Yeah.
We have. I'm a capitalist skeptic. I'm not a communist by training. So just let me declare my colors. Okay. And have been the beneficiary of a capitalist system. However, capitalism in its purest form is no longer okay. Simply isn't okay. And we've been driving I almost want to say, a false inflationary system globally, the world over. And so GDP as a measure is an interesting debate. And we can go into a whole different conversation around GDP measures. But is it accurate to measure a country's GDP and a forced inflationary environment that continues to force growth, when in fact growth actually needs a new definition? And so I don't know what we're advocating here, and I say we, and at the risk of sounding like multiple personalities in this case, what are we driving for here? We're driving for a new way of doing business. And so corporates in South Africa are going to have to redefine their purpose. Why are we in South Africa? Why are we here? What is it that we are attempting to do? And if it's not purpose-led and values-driven, the forecast is not great. And so the principles of regenerative economics are exactly that. The organizations that are surviving are those that are, Jane, back to your point, evaluating their reason for being. And if it's not purpose-driven, there's a question mark.
Awesome. Okay, so I see Cobus is back. We've managed to get him back. Cobus, if you'd like to take us through any thoughts on the session and ask the final questions for George.
Well, Michaela, sorry, George, apologies, colleagues, everyone. Life happens when you plan something else. And we had just a power failure, just like that. Now I'm sitting here in the dark, and I'm thinking, okay, so how do I? Because even the mobile tower signal goes off, so I'm totally cut off from the outside world. But anyway, I'm back. Apologies for that, George. I got you right up to that very last set of the 21. But thank you so much. I mean, it's so informed by, embedded in research, grounded in scientific rigor, and it's immensely valuable. Now, I mean, each of those 21 things that you've shared with us is possibly an entire discussion on its own. But what kind of struck me was, that words of, is it Buchan or Buchan, the one that said, there's enough for everyone's need, but there is not enough for everyone's greed. So, now just if I reflect on that one particular quotation, instead of seeing it as, okay, but if that is the fact, then because of the greed, then what does it help? What can I do? What can we on this group, on this discussion do to help make tomorrow beautiful? But if you can perhaps give us I want to call it a tip or but what are your suggestions or your thoughts around how do we go about as an individual drawing it down to the me, not looking outward, but to me? Do I get that shift in thinking that there is enough for all of our need, but greed? So how do I, on the individual level, make that kind of mind shift?
No, thanks, Cobus. And I was lucky enough to attend a talk a little while ago to answer your question, called Mind the Gap. And the Mind the Gap principle, as all of us know, we for those who've been in London, you get onto the tube, and there's this voice that says, "Mind the gap." Okay, and that's the gap between the train and the platform. But this was then juxtaposed against the start of one's life and the end of one's life. And so we're getting into philosophy here and some deep thinking. And there's the start date and there's an end date for all of us. And I think where we are now is in that gap. And it's about reevaluating our behavior, reevaluating our consumerist behavior in particular, reevaluating where we buy our products, responsible farming, sustainable principles. We need to force the consumer change here, and that is happening. The evidence of the post-virus environment is that is happening. People are far more responsible. There's been a re-emergence or resurgence of home farming. Folk are farming their pretty gardens. There are suburbs I'm in the Bedford View environment, and people have actually converted their pavements into veggie gardens with the generous principles that come with that. We are. Why wouldn't we do it? We live in one of the greatest climates in the world. Okay. So to answer your question, I think it starts with us. It starts about being mindful about the impact that we have on the planet, respectively. And I think this virus has brought about that fundamental change in thinking.
So, as someone previously said, expose the cracks. And what I found in just my own lived experience, not only the cracks in the sustainable development goals, etc., but even or on the organizational level, but even right down to the individual level, where you kind of missed things or just overlooked things, but it's now been radically exposed. We have got the shove into this this so-called new world. But now with that, there's a lot of things that pop up that we perhaps were a bit, I don't want to say ignorant about. We kind of pushed it to the sidelines, and kind of didn't really, we're not cognizant of it. But now it's kind of front and center in the executive part of our brains. So, I absolutely agree with you. Now, even in my own little context, I've pursued as just as a hobby, but even microgreens, in the small space available, but planting stuff and so forth. So absolutely fascinating. But I think you're so right that the thing of the mind shift that would be required from all of us, because we cannot expect states or governments, just constantly looking outward. And there's but if it's about greed, it's all the other people are the greedy ones. But if we start looking at our own consumption, our own way of doing things, so absolutely. George, the other thing that also came out for me was this, call it work-life balance, the new work-life balance, because we've kind of found that over the past 208 days that your work life and your personal life has kind of morphed into a concoction of horrendous that you don't make distinction between them anymore. And I think I'm not alone, and I'm not saying I'm asking the question on behalf of everyone else, but in your view, what do you think we can do again at the individual level regarding this work-life balance?
It's such a great question. So I believe work-life balance is a value. So I think what's going to have to happen within organizations, business schools, universities, our own interaction with each other, is we're going to have to redraw those boundaries. We're going to have to redraw the rules. France had already gone from a 5-day working week to a 4-day working week, and that was to deal with an unemployment challenge. I think that's where we're heading. I think we're going to have to redraw the boundaries of what work means. And so I don't have an exacting answer, but but I do think respect for boundaries, and respect for self and self-love. I think there's got to be a point where you've got to close the laptop, switch off the phone, and say, okay, there's some personal space here now, some personal boundaries.
So I suppose to a large extent, or probably to the extent, is to take responsibility for oneself. And again, I'm getting back to this, what one finds continued, what's the word, projecting outward to, what you are experiencing or what your feelings and so forth are. Again, it gets back to the individual, that if I want to change things, if it is to be, it is up to me. I think someone said.
Yes. That's exactly right.
George, no, I mean, if and I hope that you'd be willing that we could perhaps share those 21 adaptations specifically. I think that's very, very valuable. It kind of serves as a radar. Talking about the agility and the strategic development. All of us are involved in strategy, and we've got this 5-year, 10-year, 20-year, or whatever the case may be. But and we found how we had to reposition and to reconfigure. So you also speak about the new product development, real estate, the younger workforce. The new wealth is data. That's the new wealth. Another one is professional service. So, on the one on professional service, do you have any advice for our viewers in that I talk about personal branding, awareness creation? Is there any simple takeaways that one can look at as an individual? That one can start doing that you haven't done before, perhaps, in terms of that professional service?
It's such an interesting minefield. It's within its own right. So are CVs still appropriate when we position ourselves now? New jobs are being created as we speak, and so so multi-career streams are being developed as we speak. So we understand that in the next 5 years, 10 years, it can look fundamentally different. And so one's social media presence and promotion of self, with all the necessary humility and is where we're heading. If you don't have a social media presence or a profile, you don't exist. Historically, what you did was you put your CV in an envelope and you posted it, and you responded to the ad. Well, there's at least 1,000 people doing exactly the same thing, except they're doing it better.
Exactly.
They've got a social media profile. They've built up a following. And so professional services is now, yes, academic qualifications are important, experience is important, but if you're not selling yourself, a very unique selling value-added proposition here, you've got to in terms of how you position yourself. Because, let's assume we remain in lockdown for another 18 months and you're wanting to do a job change, how do you sell yourself now?
Precisely,
It's got to be through a virtual profile of yourself, preach yourself, but offering something that is really unique.
Exactly. I recall one of our previous speakers. Something that I took away from there is we underestimate the value of that little piece of real estate in your LinkedIn profile banner at the top. What is it that you're just so good at, or what is it that you actually do? I help companies with whatever, with getting their tax returns in quickly, efficiently, and whatever else. That that's something. But absolutely, but I've also had this feeling that you say if you haven't got an online presence, you don't exist. And sometimes, when you get that feeling, is maybe that's not such a bad idea in itself.
True.
But anyway, no. On a serious note, if you want to stay relevant, as you said, you really have to ensure that this virtual presence of yours is also prominent. On your education, the adaptation of education will be free, where new business models would be required. Have you got a kind of and I know, we're all just kind of making informed guesses about the future.
Sure.
But if there are any other higher education colleagues in here on the call, in your view, what timelines are we looking at? And by that, I don't want to say we should remain complacent, because once it's free, what justifies your existence? That type of thing.
Absolutely.
And then how do you sustain that institution?
It's I've seen some novel approaches the world over. The Harvards, the Oxford Saieds. What you were doing is Millpark. I mean, this is great. This virtual auditorium. This is an education session, and it hasn't cost anybody a cent. This has been free. What you hope to derive from this is word of mouth, repeat business, etc. You hope to appeal to purpose and values and all of those things. What I have seen organizations doing, particularly in the education sector, is offering modules for free and certification at a price.
Okay.
And certification, of course, is a key element here. It is engaging in the content. You do the initial assessment or evaluate, and you go, well, actually, you've done really, really well. Here's some pointers for you. By the way, now let's get you accredited. I think it's the business model per se. Is fundamentally the shift, and the draw card is access to really good quality education, initially for free, and then certification.
Okay.
One model. I mean, I think there are a series of models.
No, but very interesting, and I've also been deeply about that. It was your 10th one of fluidity thought. Would you mind just unpacking a little bit what is implied by the fluidity of thought? And along with that goes democracy, climate matters, and so forth. But I'm quite interested in the fluidity of thought.
There's, again, so many elements attached to that. But essentially, we're seeing the change of economic systems. We're seeing a convergence of planetary-minded thinking, regenerative economics, which says, well, how do we do this differently? How do we not take from the earth but actually give back to the earth? How do we use recycle? It's the circular economic principles, and that's what I mean by thought. That we are going into a real mind shift. It's been in 180 principally.
Awesome. Sure. I mean, this is so stimulating. I would, if we could go away quickly, grab a cup of coffee, and just come back and continue along these lines. The other thing, George, your 11th one about the vaccination, and I agree that it needs to be a fundamental human right. But one finds there's so many people with diverse views on, from the conspiracy theorists on the one end to the ones on the other end that say that without a vaccine humanity is doomed. And I think, how do we as consumers, or ordinary citizens for that matter, how do we, from a discernment on the information that's being fed to us, what are your views on discernment between fake or really scientific information?
Absolutely. So I'll declare my colors. I'm a scientist. I like to see the facts. So what we do know is fact. This is a flu virus. It has great mutational capabilities. And there's not a person in the world around that I've met that is truly a denialist that this is a flu virus.
Yeah, yeah,
as to how the responses happened, etc. The other fact is that human beings do develop herd immunity,
yeah,
and so,
yeah,
but it has to be controlled herd immunity.
yeah.
And so
yeah.
the third fact is that the virus impacts predominantly on people with comorbidities, and there are certain sectors of the populations that are vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so, so I think there's going to be, no doubt, an evaluation on how the World Health Organization actually managed this lockdown and its recommendations, and whether that was effective or not effective.
Yeah.
But vaccination is a must, in my view.
Yes, yes.
And we don't object to going for flu vaccinations. This will be another.
All right. Thanks, George. Really appreciate it. Listen, I can really go on and on about on this. It's fascinating, but I see we have run out of time. The questions that have been posted, I gather they have been dealt with. Yeah, I think so. That was during my absence, so I don't know how that panned out, but nevertheless, George, just from my and the team and everybody in this virtual auditorium, thank you so much again for the wisdom that you've shared with us. We'll endeavor to make it a point that those 21 adaptations reaches people who would want them. It's very, very valuable for me, for my team, and for our institution as well. But it doesn't matter what type of industry you're in, you can really reflect deeply on each one of those 21 adaptations. A wonderful takeaway. So, George, thank you again so much. Looking forward to our next engagement. Colleagues, to everyone that attended today, thank you for your time. And I'm convinced that you will leave now with a lot to think about. And remember, I think as Jane has also indicated there, the mind shift idea, as everything starts with ourselves and our own personal leadership. So take that to the bank. And colleagues, remember, tomorrow is beautiful because you and I will make it beautiful. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure.